For centuries, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain lived in relative peace, their monasteries untouched, their towns growing, their rulers focused on rivalries within their own land. But then everything changed. From the far north, across the cold and violent sea, came a force unlike any the English had ever seen. The year was 793 AD, and Britain was about to enter an age of war, fire, and steel. When the first Norse longships landed at Lindisfarne, they brought more than just war. They brought terror, they brought an unstoppable tide of warriors, ready to carve out their own kingdoms in foreign lands. The Anglo-Saxon world would never be the same again. The Viking Age had begun. For centuries, history books have told the story of Viking raids as little more than plunder and destruction, a wave of mindless violence that eventually faded away. But is that really the whole story? What if I told you that the Vikings weren't just raiders, that they weren't just plunderers, that is what they really wanted, was something far greater? Because the truth is, these Norse warriors didn't just come to burn monasteries and sail away. They came to stay, they came to rule, they came to reshape Britain itself. We will not sell nonsense in this video. We study these topics in depth to provide as much serious historical knowledge as possible. Neil Price, leading historian for Vikings history in his best-selling book, Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "The Vikings did not simply arrive, they transformed. They imposed their rule, reshaped the landscape, and left a legacy that echoes into the modern world." Their impact wasn't just felt in battle, but in law, language, and culture. The very foundation of what would become England was shaped, in part, by these Norse invaders. So how did they do it? How did a scattered force of warriors evolve into rulers of vast territories, carving out entire kingdoms within England? And how did the Anglo-Saxon world fight back? This is the story of the Viking invasions, a tale of blood and steel, of kings and warlords, of survival and transformation. And by the end of this video, you will see why the Vikings were far more than just raiders. Before we examine the first Viking raids in England, we must first understand the world from which these raiders emerged. In the late 8th century, Scandinavia was a fragmented, competitive landscape of warrior chieftains, tribal leaders, and emerging kings. Society was built on honor, loyalty, and the pursuit of reputation. Wealth and prestige were measured not just in land and goods, but in battle success, followers, and daring exploits abroad. Neil Price, in his seminal book Children of Ash and Elm, describes this world. The Vikings were not a people in the way we think of nations today. They were a network of interconnected clans and warbands, bonded by personal loyalty rather than central government. Their world was one of shifting alliances, fierce rivalries, and the constant need to prove oneself. The Scandinavian economy was largely agrarian, but recent archaeological finds suggest that trade networks stretched as far as Byzantium, the Caliphate, and the Volga River trade routes. Silver hoards unearthed in Sweden and Denmark contain Islamic dirhams, Frankish coins, and Anglo-Saxon artifacts, evidence of early contacts before full-scale Viking expansion. Vikings were not just warriors, they were merchants, shipbuilders, and explorers. The same men who raided monasteries one season might return to trade the next. The same ships that carried warbands to England also carried fur, amber, and iron to the markets of Francia and beyond. But in the late 8th century, something changed. Peter Sawyer, The Viking Expansion. The Vikings did not appear out of nowhere. Their early raids were not isolated incidents, but the result of long-standing contact with Europe, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. The Scandinavian population was growing, and rivalry among chieftains for wealth and power meant that ambitious men sought fortune across the sea. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne had expanded aggressively against the pagan Saxons, slaughtering thousands and forcefully converting them to Christianity. Some historians argue that Viking raids may have been a response, a strike against the Christian world that had encroached upon their lands and traditions. Janet L. Nelson, in The Frankish World 750 to 900, suggests the Viking Age began in the shadow of Charlemagne's wars. The brutal conquest of Saxony had not gone unnoticed in Scandinavia. In the eyes of the Norse, the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons were not just wealthy, they were enemies. It is in this context that we must view the first Viking attacks on Anglo-Saxon England. The first Viking raid on Anglo-Saxon England did not happen at Lindisfarne in 793. The earliest recorded Viking attack occurred 4 years earlier, in 789 AD, on the Isle of Portland, off the southern coast of Wessex. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, 3 ships from Hordaland, in modern Norway, landed on the shores of Portland. The local reeve, an official of King Beorhtric of Wessex, rode out to meet them. Believing them to be merchants, he ordered them to accompany him to the royal court. Instead, the Vikings drew their weapons and killed him on the spot. This small-scale skirmish did not raise widespread alarm. It was not a full-scale raid, but rather an encounter that foreshadowed what was to come. But the attack on Lindisfarne in 793 would change everything. On June 8, 793, the holy island of Lindisfarne, home to one of the most famous monasteries in Anglo-Saxon England, was attacked and looted by Viking raiders. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with horror and disbelief. Terrible portents appeared over Northumbria. Fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. Great famine followed, and then the harrowing of the heathen men. The Vikings came without warning, storming the monastery with axes and swords. Monks were slaughtered or drowned, and others were taken as slaves. The raiders plundered the monastery's gold and silver relics, even tearing sacred books from their bindings to steal the jeweled covers. Neil Price describes the psychological impact of this attack. The monastery at Lindisfarne was not just a wealthy target, it was a beacon of Christianity in a pagan world. The Vikings understood the shock value of their assault. It was a calculated act of devastation, a message written in blood. Lindisfarne was not well defended. The monks had no weapons, no walls, no warriors to protect them. Historian Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, notes, "The attack on Lindisfarne was a warning, a brutal declaration that the Vikings were now a force to be reckoned with. It shattered the illusion that England was safe from the chaos of the outside world." For the Anglo-Saxons, this was not merely a raid, it was an apocalyptic event. The pagan Norse had violated a sacred place, and for many it seemed like a punishment from God. After Lindisfarne, Viking attacks became more frequent and more organized. 794 AD, the monastery of Jarrow was raided. 795 AD, the Scottish monastery of Iona was sacked. 841 AD, Dublin was founded by Vikings, establishing a permanent Norse presence in Ireland. By the early 9th century, the Viking raiders evolved their strategy. Instead of simple hit-and-run raids, Viking warbands began to overwinter in England. The first known Viking winter camp was established in 851 AD in the Isle of Thanet. This signalled a shift. The Vikings were no longer just raiders, but invaders and settlers. Gareth Williams, Viking Britain, an exploration. By the mid-9th century, Viking raids were no longer seasonal affairs. They were strategic, planned, and in many cases intended for long-term occupation. Anglo-Saxon kings, divided and weakened by internal rivalries, struggled to mount a unified defence. Some, like King Ethelred of Northumbria, attempted to resist but were crushed. Others, like the rulers of East Anglia, chose to pay tribute rather than fight. This period set the stage for the greatest Viking invasion of all, the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 AD. The first Viking attacks on Anglo-Saxon England were devastating, but they were only the beginning. What started as small-scale raids would soon evolve into a full-scale war for the control of England. As the 9th century dawned, the Norse set their sights not just on gold, but on land, power, and conquest. The storm was just beginning. The early Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon England were not random acts of mindless plunder. They were calculated, strategic, and adaptive. What began as sporadic, small-scale attacks in the late 8th century quickly transformed into a systematized, large-scale military strategy by the mid-9th century. The reasons behind this transformation were complex, rooted in both internal Scandinavian developments and external opportunities presented by a divided England. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes the Viking expansion as a tidal wave of ambition, violence, and necessity, born from a society where war and wealth were intertwined. To raid was to thrive, to conquer was to become immortal. This section explores how Viking raiding evolved from isolated coastal strikes into a sustained campaign of terror and control, fundamentally reshaping Anglo-Saxon England. The first Viking raids had been quick, opportunistic strikes on poorly defended monasteries and villages. These were not wars of conquest, at least not yet. Instead, they were probing attacks designed to test the weaknesses of the Anglo-Saxon world. What made Viking raids so effective? Several key advantages made early Viking raids devastatingly successful. The element of surprise. Anglo-Saxon rulers had no warning systems or standing armies ready to respond. Monasteries, trade centres, and villages were unprepared for sudden attacks. Superior mobility. The longship. Viking longships were faster, lighter, and more maneuverable than any ship in England. They could land anywhere: beaches, riverbanks, marshes, avoiding heavily guarded ports. Unlike traditional armies, Vikings did not need roads. They used rivers as highways, penetrating deep into Anglo-Saxon territory before anyone knew they were there. Tactical precision. Vikings targeted rich, undefended locations, particularly monasteries. Unlike Anglo-Saxon armies, which fought in pitched battles, Viking forces relied on ambushes, deception, and lightning-fast retreats. Psychological warfare. The deliberate destruction of monasteries was meant to shock and demoralize the Anglo-Saxons. Stories of monks being slaughtered and churches burned spread rapidly, creating fear and hesitation among local rulers. The belief that these raiders were a punishment from God led many Anglo-Saxons to turn to prayer rather than military action. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, explains, the Vikings did not just kill their victims, they shattered the very idea of security. No king, no fortress, no divine protection could stop them. Their raids struck at the heart of Anglo-Saxon identity. The first Anglo-Saxon responses to Viking raids were weak and ineffective. The reasons for this failure were twofold: political disunity. Unlike the centralized Carolingian Empire in Francia, Anglo-Saxon England was divided into multiple rival kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia. These kingdoms often fought each other more than they fought the Vikings. This meant that when one kingdom was attacked, the others often did nothing, assuming it was not their problem. Peter Sawyer in The Viking Expansion notes, The fragmentation of Anglo-Saxon England was the Vikings' greatest advantage. As long as the kings and ealdormen remained divided, the Norse were free to strike at will, and the second reason was a lack of military infrastructure. No standing army, kings had to summon local warriors, the feared, whenever an invasion occurred, a process that took weeks, by which time the Vikings had already looted and left. No naval defences. England had no warships capable of intercepting Viking fleets, no fortifications. Most English towns were open settlements with no defensive walls, making them easy targets. The Vikings had recognized these weaknesses early on, and they exploited them relentlessly. By the 820s, the Vikings had grown bolder. Their targets expanded beyond monasteries to include royal estates, direct attacks on the wealth of Anglo-Saxon kings and nobles, market towns, disrupting trade and crippling the economy, inland villages, proving that no part of England was safe. A crucial change occurred in 830 when Viking fleets began raiding deeper into the countryside. Instead of single raids, multiple Viking warbands now coordinated attacks on different regions simultaneously. This shift marked the transition from isolated plundering to a systematic war economy, where raiding became a permanent cycle of looting, enslaving, and demanding tribute. Timothy Bolton, in the empire of Canute the Great, writes, "What had once been seasonal raiding became an industry, one that fed wealth and power back into Scandinavia, fueling further expeditions." At this stage, many Anglo-Saxon rulers began paying tribute, Darngeld, rather than fighting. This decision to buy off the Vikings would have disastrous consequences in the decades to come. One reason Viking raiding continued to escalate was because of how it fundamentally shaped Scandinavian society. Younger sons of noble families, who had no land to inherit, took to the seas to gain wealth and reputation. Warriors who succeeded abroad returned home as powerful leaders, gaining influence in their local communities. Norse mythology glorified warriors who died in battle, reinforcing the idea that raiding was not just about wealth. It was a path to honour. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes this mindset. A Viking's reputation was his most prized possession. To die unknown was to die twice. To carve one's name into history through battle, through raiding, through fearless deeds, was to achieve true immortality. For many Vikings, plundering England was not just a means of survival, it was their destiny. By the early 850s, the Viking strategy had evolved yet again. They were no longer seasonal raiders. They were staying for longer periods, wintering in England, and establishing semi-permanent bases. Their fleet sizes increased, allowing for larger, more coordinated assaults. They had discovered that tribute payments were as valuable as plunder, leading to massive economic exploitation of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons were beginning to understand the scale of the threat they faced, but by the time they realized it, it was too late. The Great Heathen Army was coming. In the decades following the Lindisfarne raid of 793, Viking activity in Anglo-Saxon England escalated dramatically. Initially, these attacks were sporadic, carried out by small bands of warriors looking for quick wealth. But by the 820s and 830s, Viking incursions became increasingly systematic, larger in scale, and more sophisticated. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, describes this shift. The first Viking raids were like lightning strikes, sudden, unpredictable, and devastating. But by the early 9th century, the Norse had transformed these raids into a carefully honed system of warfare, one that would bring Anglo-Saxon England to its knees. This transformation was driven by several key factors: experience and intelligence gathering. Early raids had revealed which sites were the richest and least defended. More warriors and larger fleets. As Viking success stories spread, more men joined these expeditions, swelling the ranks of raiding parties. The development of overwintering camps. Instead of returning home each winter, Viking warbands began establishing semi-permanent bases in England and Ireland. Political instability in Anglo-Saxon England, internal conflicts between kings and rival kingdoms left the land vulnerable to outside attack. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, writes, "The Vikings quickly learned that England was a land divided, and where division existed, opportunity followed. With no unified resistance, they could strike at will, exploiting political rivalries to their advantage." This section will examine the evolution of Viking raids in the 794 to 830 period, focusing on their growing sophistication, new targets, and how the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms attempted, unsuccessfully, to resist. After the Lindisfarne attack in 793, Viking warbands wasted no time in launching follow-up raids on other Anglo-Saxon and Celtic sites. Key Viking raids, 794 to 806. 794, Jarrow Monastery raided, home of the late Bede, a revered Anglo-Saxon scholar. 795, Vikings attacked Iona Abbey in Scotland, signalling their expansion westward. 798, raids along the Cornish and Welsh coasts, showing early Norse interest in the Celtic world. 802 and 806, the monastery at Iona was attacked again, with over 68 monks slaughtered in a single raid. The repeated targeting of monasteries was no accident. These were centers of wealth, containing gold and silver religious artifacts, as well as books and illuminated manuscripts bound in decorated leather and studded with jewels. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, notes, "Monasteries were not just economic targets, they were symbolic ones. By striking at the heart of Christianity, the Vikings sent a clear message. No place, no faith, no king was beyond their reach." But monasteries were only the beginning. By the 800s and 10s, the Vikings had expanded their targets beyond monasteries. Now they turned their attention to towns, ports, and key trade routes, dealing a devastating blow to England's nascent economy. New Viking target categories, trade settlements and market towns, major river ports, royal estates and aristocratic manors. These new targets revealed a shift in Viking strategy. They were no longer just looting religious centres. They were crippling the economic infrastructure of England. They attacked the wealth of kings and noble families, forcing them into submission. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, explains, "By targeting the trade networks of Anglo-Saxon England, the Vikings achieved a secondary victory, economic warfare. It was not just about the silver they stole, but the disruption they caused." One of the most significant Viking attacks of this period occurred in 841, when Viking ships sailed up the Thames and plundered London. This marked the first time the Vikings had attacked one of England's largest cities, a clear indication of their growing ambitions. The first Viking strongholds were formed in Dublin and Chepay from 835 to 841. Dublin, for example, was founded in 841. In Ireland, Viking warriors established a permanent base at Dublin, which became one of the most important Norse settlements in the British Isles. This allowed for constant raids on England from across the Irish Sea. Isle of Sheppey was attacked in 835. This was the first recorded Viking raid on the Kingdom of Kent. Sheppey's strategic position in the Thames estuary made it a prime location for future invasions. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, An Exploration, describes the importance of these new bases. By securing a permanent foothold in Ireland and along the English coast, the Vikings gained something they had never had before, staging grounds for larger invasions. This shift in Viking activity forced the Anglo-Saxons to rethink their approach to defence. As Viking attacks became more frequent and devastating, the Anglo-Saxon rulers struggled to respond effectively. Their main challenges were lack of coordination. Each Anglo-Saxon kingdom acted independently, failing to form a unified defense. When one kingdom was attacked, others often stood by, seeing it as someone else's problem. Slow military mobilization. The Anglo-Saxon army, known as the Fyrd, was not a professional standing force. By the time local lords could summon their warriors, the Vikings had already looted and left. Failure to defend. Key rivers and ports. The Anglo-Saxons did not have a navy to intercept Viking fleets. They also failed to fortify river towns and coastal settlements, allowing Vikings to strike deep inland with ease. Peter Sawyer in the Viking expansion argues that the Anglo-Saxons were still fighting battles in the old way, large, set-piece engagements, while the Vikings fought in a new way, rapid, mobile, unpredictable warfare. This failure to adapt led to massive territorial losses in the decades ahead. By the end of the 830s, Viking raids on England had expanded from monasteries to trade centres and cities, established key bases in Ireland and the Thames estuary, exposed the military and political weaknesses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the worst was yet to come. In the 800s and 50s, the Vikings would take the final step toward permanent conquest, staying through the winter, establishing armies, and bringing England to the brink of collapse. The Great Heathen Army was on the horizon. By the 830s, Viking warfare in England had undergone a critical transformation. What had begun as seasonal raids on coastal monasteries and villages had now evolved into a strategic campaign of inland penetration. Instead of simply attacking and retreating, the Vikings began pushing deeper into Anglo-Saxon territory using England's vast network of rivers. This new phase of Viking expansion marked the shift from hit-and-run piracy to sustained economic and military pressure on England's heartlands. Eleanor Parker in Dragonlords, The History and Legends of Viking England writes, "The rivers of England were not barriers to Viking invasion. They were highways of war. With their longships, the Norsemen could strike deep into the heart of Anglo-Saxon England, bypassing defences and taking the fight to the very doorstep of the English kings." This chapter explores how the Vikings adapted their strategy, how their ability to navigate England's rivers made nowhere safe, and how Anglo-Saxon rulers failed to counter this threat effectively. In the early 830s, Viking leaders recognized that England's greatest weakness was not just its lack of a united defense, but also its geography. 4 key advantages of river raiding: access to the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. England's major towns and trade centres were located along navigable rivers: London on the Thames, York on the Ouse, Nottingham on the Trent. By sailing up these rivers, the Vikings could bypass natural coastal defences and strike deeper inland. Surprise and speed Anglo-Saxon armies could not move as fast as Viking longships. A Viking warband could raid a town, plunder it, and escape before the local Fyrd militia could be summoned. No naval resistance. The Anglo-Saxons had no organised navy capable of patrolling the rivers. Even major cities like London and York had no fleets to intercept Viking raiders. Richer, more valuable targets. Coastal monasteries had been plundered repeatedly and were no longer the wealthiest targets. Towns and trade centres offered far greater rewards, including gold, silver, livestock and slaves. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking expansion, emphasises the importance of this shift. With the rivers open to them, the Vikings no longer had to settle for monasteries and villages. Now, they could take the wealth of entire kingdoms. By the late 830s, Viking fleets were no longer just raiding. They were coordinating large-scale operations across multiple regions. Key river raids of the 830s and 840s, 835. First recorded Viking attack on the Thames, Kent. A Viking fleet sailed up the Thames, raiding towns and monasteries along its banks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, "A great host of heathens came up the river and spread ruin upon the land." This was the first confirmed instance of Vikings using England's river system to strike inland. 841, Viking sack of London, Rochester, and Southampton, London, one of England's largest and wealthiest cities, was attacked by Viking longships sailing up the Thames. Rochester, a key defensive stronghold, was besieged and burned. Southampton, an important trading port with Francia, was plundered and left in ruins. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes the impact of the London raid. The sacking of London in 841 was a wake-up call. This was no longer a problem of coastal defences. This was a direct challenge to the economic and political stability of Anglo-Saxon England. This was the moment when Viking raids transformed from an annoyance to an existential threat. By the early 850s, Viking forces no longer raided and left immediately. They began to stay longer, overwintering and preparing for further campaigns. Key turning point, the Isle of Sheppey, 800s and 50s. Located at the mouth of the Thames, the Isle of Sheppey became the first recorded Viking winter base in England. Instead of retreating to Scandinavia, Viking warriors built temporary fortifications, allowing them to launch raids earlier in the year. This shift marked the beginning of permanent Viking settlements in England. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, An Exploration, highlights the strategic importance of these bases. With bases like Sheppey, the Vikings could now raid England year-round. They no longer needed to return home, they were home. This would have massive consequences, setting the stage for the Great Heathen Army's full-scale invasion in 865. The shift to river raiding and overwintering should have forced the Anglo-Saxon rulers to adapt. Instead, their response was slow, disorganized, and ultimately ineffective. Three major failures of the Anglo-Saxon response. Failure to build a navy. Even after repeated Viking attacks via the rivers, no serious attempt was made to build a fleet to intercept the Norse ships. King Ethelwulf of Wessex tried to launch small-scale naval operations, but these were too little, too late. Failure to fortify towns and river ports. Unlike the Franks, who began fortifying their towns under Charlemagne, the Anglo-Saxons left their river cities vulnerable. London was raided multiple times, proving that its defences were inadequate. Political disunity and weak leadership. The kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia failed to coordinate any joint response to the Viking threat. Instead of preparing for long-term war, many rulers simply paid the Vikings tribute, Danegeld, to go away. Peter Sawyer, in The Viking Expansion, describes this as a critical failure of leadership. The Anglo-Saxon kings reacted as though the Viking threat was temporary, when in reality it was only growing stronger. By the end of the 800s and 50s, Viking warbands had transformed from coastal raiders into river-based invaders, established permanent winter camps for sustained campaigns, exposed the complete military failure of Anglo-Saxon England. The Vikings had mastered England's geography, and the Anglo-Saxon world had no effective answer. The next step would be full-scale invasion. The Great Heathen Army was about to arrive. By the early 850s, it had become painfully clear that the Vikings were not going away. They had shifted from coastal raiders to riverborne invaders, striking deep into Anglo-Saxon territory. They had pillaged and burned major cities, including London and Rochester. They had established winter camps on English soil, ensuring that each year's raids would begin earlier and last longer. The Anglo-Saxon response to this crisis was disorganized, inconsistent, and often ineffective. Some kings fought back with military force, while others paid tribute, Danegeld, to buy temporary peace. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes this period as a time of desperation in which Anglo-Saxon rulers had to choose between futile resistance or humiliating submission, and all too often they chose the latter. This chapter explores the Anglo-Saxon response to the Viking onslaught, focusing on their military campaigns, fortification efforts, and the controversial policy of paying off the Norse invaders. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, explains, unlike the Franks, who had the centralized power of Charlemagne, the Anglo-Saxons were divided and weak. This gave the Vikings a golden opportunity to exploit. First, major battles against the Vikings' Battle of Carhampton, 840 AD, Wessex versus Vikings. King Ethelwulf of Wessex led an army against a Viking warband that had established a base in Somerset. The battle was inconclusive, and the Vikings continued their raids on Wessex for years. Battle of Aclea, 851 AD, Wessex versus Vikings. King Ethelwulf's son, Ethelbald, led a major victory against the Norse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it as a great slaughter of the heathen army such as never before had been seen in this land. Despite this victory, the Vikings kept returning, proving that individual battles could not stop them. As Viking attacks continued to escalate, some Anglo-Saxon rulers began negotiating with the Norse instead of fighting them. This led to the rise of Danegeld, a ransom paid to Viking leaders in exchange for temporary peace. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, describes Danegeld as a desperate measure, but a logical one. If the Anglo-Saxons could not defeat the Vikings in battle, then at least they could pay them to leave. Immediate relief. Paying off the Vikings stopped raids in the short term, sparing towns from destruction. Lack of military options. Anglo-Saxon rulers did not have the forces to wage long-term war against the Norse. Viking leaders were willing to negotiate. The Vikings were not just warriors, but pragmatic businessmen. If they could get gold without fighting, they often accepted it. Judith Jesch, in Women in the Viking Age, explains, Danegeld was not just a ransom, it became a business model. Viking leaders realized that threatening to raid was just as profitable as raiding itself. Major Danegeld payments in the 850s, King Ethelwulf of Wessex, 854 AD, paid a huge sum of silver to a Viking fleet threatening Wessex. The Vikings left temporarily but returned the next year. King Burgred of Mercia, 860 AD. After Viking forces sacked London, Burgred paid them off rather than fight. Mercia remained vulnerable to further attacks, proving that Danegeld was only a temporary solution. This cycle of paying off the Vikings, only for them to return later, would plague England for decades. By the mid-800s and 50s, some Anglo-Saxon kings finally recognized that tribute payments were not enough. They began to build fortified towns and defensive structures to resist Viking incursions. First, fortified burhs, early Wessex defences, 860s. Small walled enclosures were built around important towns. These provided temporary shelter for civilians during Viking raids. However, these early burhs were rudimentary and did not prevent major invasions. Mercia's failed fortifications, 860s. King Burgred attempted to fortify the River Trent to stop Viking longships, but his defences were not properly manned, and the Vikings easily bypassed them. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, notes, the Anglo-Saxons were slow to understand what the Franks had already learned. The only way to resist the Vikings was to fortify every major town and create an organized military response. Despite some victories and defensive efforts, the Anglo-Saxon response to the Vikings remained ineffective throughout the 850s. Tribute payments only encouraged more invasions. Fortifications were too weak and too few. Military resistance was uncoordinated and inconsistent. And then, in 865 AD, the worst-case scenario became a reality. A massive Viking invasion force, known as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia, not to raid, but to conquer. Timothy Bolton, in the Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "The Anglo-Saxon kings had spent decades treating the Vikings as a nuisance. But the Great Heathen Army was no raiding party. It was an organized military force, and it was here to stay. The years of tribute and scattered resistance had failed. Now, England would face its greatest test of survival. Despite the failures of the 850s, the Anglo-Saxons still had one last chance to unite against the Norse threat. But in 865 AD, everything changed. A massive Viking invasion force, later known as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. Unlike previous Viking fleets, this was not a raiding party. It was a coordinated military campaign designed for full-scale conquest. Led by legendary warriors such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, the Great Heathen Army would march across England, toppling kingdoms and shattering the old order. Timothy Bolton, in the Empire of Canute the Great, writes, "The Great Heathen Army was the moment when everything changed. The Viking Age in England entered a new phase, one of occupation, settlement, and the redefinition of Anglo-Saxon rule." Peter Sawyer, in The Viking Expansion, argues, "The Anglo-Saxon kings had failed to recognize the true scale of the Viking threat. The Great Heathen Army would teach them a lesson they would never forget." The Viking Age in England had begun with sporadic raids, but by the late 800s and 50s, it had become a full-blown crisis. Viking armies were no longer raiders, they were conquerors. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had failed to unite against the Norse. Permanent Viking bases were now established in England. And now, in 865 AD, the Great Heathen Army had arrived. The question was no longer if the Anglo-Saxons would resist, but how long they could survive. And that's where we'll pause for now. In part 2, we'll follow the rise of Alfred the Great, his brutal war with the Viking invaders, the birth of the Danelaw, and the rise of Knut the Great's North Sea Empire. We'll bring the Viking Age to its dramatic end at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. That chapter in history drops next week, so be sure to subscribe. And don't miss the conclusion to the Viking saga. Thanks for watching.